I never imagined that a single sentence, spoken so calmly and publicly, could slice through me so cleanly. "Marietta will not be receiving anything from the estate," she said. Just like that. No hesitation. No shame. My daughter-in-law stood up during my husband's reading, looked around that boardroom like she owned every corner of it, and with one flat sentence erased me. I didn't cry. I didn't blink. I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the sound of legal words pass over me like a train I couldn't stop. My name, his wife of 43 years, wasn't even uttered. But when the lawyer chuckled, yes, laughed, something inside me cracked. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Rebecca like he knew something she didn't. That was the moment I felt it, him. Like Patrick had reached out from beyond the grave with a warning. Don't let this go. After the service, I stood in the garden watching cars disappear down the long driveway. No one offered to drive me home. No one even asked if I was all right. The folding chairs were still scattered, coffee cups half full on the stone table. The scent of lilies sharp and cloying in the cold air. Rebecca had arranged everything, from the flower arrangements to the curated slideshow with perfect transitions. Everything about the funeral was clean, elegant, wrong. It wasn't Patrick. He would have hated every second of it. Funerals should be messy, he used to say. People should cry loudly, forget their umbrellas, and laugh at the worst stories. He believed grief should be real, not something you choreograph like a boardroom presentation. But that's what this was, a staged performance. And I wasn't invited to be part of the cast. When I stepped back into the house, Rebecca was already at the dining table, collecting legal folders like it was just another workday. I cleared my throat softly, needing to ask her something. She didn't even look up. "We'll begin legal processing next week," she said, like I wasn't standing 2 feet away, like I hadn't just spent 6 months sleeping in a hospital chair beside the man she now referred to only as the deceased. I stood frozen. For years, I had fed him, washed him, whispered stories into his ear when the chemo left him too tired to speak. I held his hand when the machines beeped too loud. She was flying around the country for conferences and board meetings. But now here she was, owning everything, speaking over me, brushing past like I didn't exist. Then she handed me a small box. "He asked me to give you this," she said. "Inside, just a tie clip. No letter, no note, just a small silver piece that I didn't recognize. He had dozens of tie clips. This wasn't even one he wore often. No significance, no story. Just a loose, and she tied off with a fake smile. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen. Lukewarm tea clutched between my fingers. The walls still smelled like Patrick, his old aftershave, the one he wore on Sundays. His slippers were still by the back door. But the silence now, it wasn't comforting. It wasn't home. It was empty, hollow, like my name had been erased from every corner of the life we built together. I stared out the window, telling myself I was overthinking. Maybe grief was making me paranoid. But no, it was something else. Something colder, like a decision had been made behind closed doors, and everyone else had been handed a new script. Except me. The next morning, I opened my email. One new message. Subject: Estate Administration meeting scheduled. No, hope you're doing okay. No, would love to connect. Just cold black letters from Rebecca's assistant, telling me to be at her firm's downtown office on Wednesday at 9 a.m. I stared at it for nearly 10 minutes. The woman couldn't even email me herself. I wasn't a person anymore. I was an obstacle. Wednesday came fast. I was 5 minutes late, not by choice, but because I stopped twice in my car, wondering if I should even go. What would I say? What could I say? The elevator opened to a sleek office that smelled like eucalyptus and printer ink. A young receptionist gave me a look like I didn't belong there. I smoothed my coat and followed her down the glass hallway. The conference room door closed behind me with a gentle click. Inside were 7 people, all in dark suits. Rebecca sat at the head of the table, not smiling. Just a polite nod toward an empty chair at the far end, away from the folders, away from the coffee. No one greeted me. No one handed me anything. I sat down with my hands folded, the only one at the table not holding a pen. Rebecca cleared her throat. "As executor of the estate," she began, "I'll be walking us through the distribution of assets per the finalized will." Her voice was clipped, emotionless, like she was giving a quarterly report. She talked about stocks, trust accounts, a winery investment I'd never heard about. Then she said it. Patrick had transferred primary control of the family trust to her 6 months ago. I blinked. That wasn't right. I had been managing that trust with him for nearly 20 years. We reviewed it together every quarter. He never said a word about transferring it. The meeting continued. My name didn't come up once. At the end, one of the junior lawyers asked a soft question. "And Mrs. Sloane's share?" Rebecca didn't even look up. "There are no remaining distributions assigned to her under the current filing." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't blink. The room went silent for a beat too long, but no one said a word. I waited until everyone else had left. Rebecca closed her briefcase slowly, like she expected me to say something, but I didn't. I stood, adjusted my scarf, and walked out. Downstairs, the wind hit my face hard, but I didn't cry, because crying would mean accepting it, and I wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. When I got home, I didn't turn the lights on. I just stood in the hallway, the same hallway where Patrick used to wait for me with 2 mugs of tea, one with honey, the other plain. His cane still rested near the back door, exactly where he'd left it after our last chemo visit. I hadn't moved it. I couldn't. Touching it felt like giving in. I went to the study not with intention, but because my body led me there. Patrick's desk still had his things, receipts, pencils, a few crumpled post-its, with book titles scrawled in his barely readable handwriting. I opened the middle drawer, the one that squeaked. He used to say it needed oil. I always said I liked it that way. It let me know when he was home. Tucked beneath a cloth-bound ledger, I found a slim manila folder. No label, no date. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The first stopped my breath. It was his handwriting, shaky but unmistakable. A note, written with his favorite blue pen. No greeting, no closing, just raw thoughts spilled across the page. Rebecca wants me to update the will. Says it needs to reflect current holdings. I asked her why now. She said it's for clarity. I think she's being careful. Too careful. She started drafting things for me. I haven't signed anything. I haven't told Marietta. I know she'll ask questions I'm not ready to answer. I read those lines over and over, my eyes burning. He knew. He knew something wasn't right, and yet he kept it to himself. Why? The second page was a photocopy of a will, not the one Rebecca read at the meeting. This version had scribbled edits in the margins. My name was in the original text. In the event of my passing, I leave my personal assets, including our home, shares, and designated accounts, to my wife, Marietta Sloane. But it was crossed out. Next to it in red pen, discuss with Rebecca. My chest tightened. The third page was a schedule. Legal consultations, appointments. Most of them were from a time when Patrick was in and out of treatments, when he could barely stay awake through a conversation. He never told me he was seeing anyone, discussing documents, signing drafts. But then again, I hadn't been there for all of it. Rebecca had taken over those hours. She told me to go rest, take breaks, go home and eat. I thought she was being kind. Now I knew better. I stared at the documents for a long time. The silence in the room had weight now, like a witness refusing to speak. By morning, I made a decision. I couldn't let this go. Not quietly, not politely. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. Daniel Cow. He was an old friend, Patrick's colleague from back in the nonprofit days. A solid man, steady voice, sharp mind, someone Patrick had trusted. He picked up after the second ring. "Marietta," he said, uncertain. "It's me," I said. "I need to talk." He paused just for a beat, then said, "Tomorrow. Same cafe on Elm Street." "Yes," I whispered. "Tomorrow." That afternoon, I cleaned up the documents, placed them back in the folder, and slipped it into a locked box beneath the hallway closet. Alongside passports, medical files, and the note Patrick had once written me on our 20th anniversary. "You're the spine of my story." The next morning, the cafe smelled exactly the same. Warm wood, burnt coffee, and old jazz. Daniel slid into the booth across from me, coat still damp from the morning drizzle. He didn't waste time, just opened the folder, reading every word in silence. When he saw the handwritten note from Patrick, his brow furrowed. "This isn't just suspicious," he said after a long pause. "It's intentional." He pulled out a notebook from his coat pocket and began writing down dates, firm names, everything he could extract from the documents. He paused when he got to the witness names on the updated will. "You recognize either of these?" he asked. I shook my head. "Never met them." Patrick always used someone he trusted. A neighbor, a friend. He wouldn't bring in strangers unless someone else orchestrated it. We agreed to dig quietly. No confrontation. Not yet. Daniel would pull certified copies of the official will filed with the county, compare them to what I had. I would leave everything else untouched for now. Back at home, I pulled out Patrick's old calendar. Rebecca had taken most of his things, boxed up his books, donated clothes, even sent his golf clubs to someone he barely knew. But she'd missed this. His leather-bound planner was still on the study shelf. That's where I found the name. Hal Givens. Penciled in, circled twice. A faint memory stirred. Hal was a tax consultant Patrick had worked with briefly through a nonprofit. I hadn't seen him in years. But why had Patrick met him during those final months without telling me? I called Daniel. "He might have been part of the planning," I said. "Or maybe he saw something." "I'll look into it," Daniel replied, discreetly. The next few days passed like molasses. I did everything as usual. Groceries, watered the plants, went to book club. But I barely said a word. I was watching now, listening. Then, Friday, Daniel called. "I spoke to Hal," he said. "Marietta, what he told me." I held my breath. Patrick came to him, looking exhausted. Hal said he seemed unsure, asking about beneficiary designations, protections for you, legal language he didn't seem comfortable with. He even scheduled a follow-up, but he never showed. "Why not?" I asked, though I already knew. Rebecca called to cancel. Said Patrick didn't need the service anymore. I didn't speak. I just gripped the phone tighter. "Hal still has his notes," Daniel continued. "They're not binding, but they show intent. Doubt. Enough to raise serious questions." I sat on the edge of the bed long after the call ended. That night, I pulled out an old photo album. I didn't do it for memories. I did it for evidence. I studied every photo, every event. Rebecca was always there, helping, smiling, positioned just right. Always near the power, the documents, the decision-makers. She had been planning this for a long time. And Patrick? He'd known, but he hadn't said a word. I turned off the light and whispered one sentence into the dark. "I'll find the truth, Patrick. I promise." Monday morning came with rain. Steady. Thin drops tapping the windows like a soft warning. I sat with my coffee untouched, eyes fixed on the outside world as it blurred behind glass. At exactly 9:15, the phone rang. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. His voice, though calm, carried urgency. "The county records came in," he said. "There's something strange." I leaned in, heart already racing. The finalized version of Patrick's will, the one Rebecca read at the meeting. It's filed under a different case number than the original draft we reviewed together last year. I frowned. "That's not unusual." "No," he admitted, "but the original file, the one you and Patrick had looked at together, it's gone. Marked as superseded. Yes, but there's no digital trail. No clerk, no filing timestamp. Just missing. I sat in stunned silence. Missing? A legal will doesn't just vanish. I think it's time we bring in someone else, Daniel said. Her name is Lydia Velasquez. Probate litigation. She's handled contested wills before. She's sharp. Do it, I said without hesitation. We met on Wednesday morning in Daniel's office. Lydia arrived precisely on time, mid-50s, sleek gray coat, hair pulled back, eyes razor-focused. She didn't waste words. She sat, opened a leather folio, and asked for everything. Notes, calendar entries, the scanned documents I had shared, even Rebecca's formal notices. When Daniel mentioned the witness names again, Lydia raised a brow. I've seen those names before, she said. They're unlicensed notaries, paid signatures often used when someone wants to sidestep proper witnessing protocol. My stomach dropped. Lydia scribbled something fast and underlined it twice. This isn't carelessness, she said. This looks designed. I watched her and Daniel work in silence, two professionals combing through my life like surgeons in an operating room. I wanted to speak, to say something, but what was left? My voice had been ignored for weeks, maybe longer. Finally, Lydia leaned back and looked me in the eye. I'm filing an inquiry with the probate court, she said. If Rebecca filed something improperly, there will be evidence, digital or physical. A paper trail always exists, even when people try to erase it. That afternoon, I went somewhere I hadn't in weeks, the garage. I opened Patrick's old file cabinet. It still smelled faintly like pine and tobacco. The bottom drawer, his tax drawer, held folders labeled by year, meticulously organized, just like he always kept them. In the folder marked from the previous year, I found something that made my throat tighten. Revocable Living Trust Addendum, draft. It wasn't signed. The draft had several red edits, cross-outs, reworded phrases, as if Patrick had gone back and forth on how to structure it. But there, under the section titled Survivor Protections, was my name, written clearly. Health care support, property security, legal representation, all noted under his handwriting. In the margin, one line stopped me cold. We talked about this. Rebecca said she'd handle it. It was the moment he handed it all over. Whether from trust or exhaustion, I'd never know. But that scribble said more than any typed sentence ever could. I made a clean copy and called Daniel. Bring it tomorrow, he said. That night, I sat on the back porch with a shawl over my shoulders. The wind carried a chill, and my body ached, not from age, but from carrying too many unanswered questions. I thought of how my name had been wiped so cleanly. Not argued, not debated, just gone. And I remembered something Patrick used to say. Love means asking hard questions, even when it's easier to stay quiet. He hadn't asked, so now I would. The next morning, I handed the document to Lydia. She read it in silence, then pressed her lips together and nodded. This helps, she said. It confirms original intent. It proves Patrick wanted you protected. That's leverage. She explained the next legal step, a motion to freeze all estate assets. If the court approved, Rebecca wouldn't be able to move any funds or property until the investigation ended. This isn't retaliation, Lydia said. It's protection. I nodded. That's all I want. Not revenge, just the truth, and space to breathe. 3 days later, Lydia called again. It went through, she said. Motion approved. Assets frozen, effective immediately. I didn't say anything. I just let the silence settle over me like warm water. That afternoon, I received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a thick cardstock invitation, the kind you send to wealthy donors or charity events. Glossy, embossed. Rebecca was hosting a tribute to Patrick at the country club 4 days from now. Cocktails, speeches, a charity auction in his name. There had been no call, no message, no discussion, just an invite, as if I were an outsider, as if I hadn't spent 4 decades at his side. I set it on the table and stared at it for a long time. That evening, I called Daniel. "I want to go," I said. He didn't ask why. He just said, "Then go. But don't go alone." "I will," I replied, "but not for confrontation." "Then why?" "For presence." Rebecca had stolen the spotlight. Now, she would have to look me in the eye. Saturday came fast. I chose my clothes carefully: navy slacks, a silk blouse Patrick had bought me for our 35th anniversary, a thin silver chain. Quiet power. No statement, no drama. Just truth wrapped in fabric. The parking lot was already full when I arrived. The guest list at the door read like a who's who of Patrick's world. Donors, colleagues, board members, people who had eaten in my home, toasted my birthdays, kissed me on the cheek after long dinners. Inside it was pristine, polished floors, soft music, champagne flutes everywhere. Patrick's photo stood by the bar. Not one I would have chosen. He looked tired, distant. Rebecca's choice. She was in the center of it all. Graceful. Controlled. Speaking in soft circles to people who adored her poise. When her eyes met mine, something flickered. Only for a second. Then she smiled. I didn't. I moved to the auction display. Items labeled as Patrick's favorites. A signed baseball. A fountain pen. A rare edition of a novel I'd given him on his 50th birthday. My name wasn't on the label. No mention of me at all. A man I didn't recognize approached. "You must be Mrs. Sloane," he said kindly. "Patrick spoke so highly of you." I smiled politely. "So, how are you handling the estate?" I blinked. "Oh, I'm not the trustee," I said. His brows lifted. "Oh, I thought Rebecca said—" He didn't finish. He just nodded and stepped away. In that moment, I realized she hadn't told them. Not the whole truth. Not about the will. Not about the trust. Not about what had been taken. And that told me everything. I stayed just long enough to be noticed, and then slowly made my way out. Before leaving, I spoke briefly to one of Patrick's old board colleagues. His name was Alan, sharp man, warm voice. He'd been around for decades. As we exchanged small pleasantries, he casually mentioned he'd received an email from Rebecca a few weeks before Patrick passed. Nothing suspicious on its face. Something about donation tiers, foundation planning, a few lines about managing partner responsibilities. But it made something in my chest tighten. She hadn't waited for him to pass. She'd started carving out her position while he was still breathing. When I got back to the car, I sat there with my hands on the wheel. Engine off. Silence wrapping around me like fog. It all clicked together. The missing will, the rushed legal processing, the changes to trust documents, and now this curated public tribute. This wasn't about honoring Patrick. It was about taking control before anyone had time to notice. But now I had noticed. The very next morning, I met Daniel and Lydia in their office. I brought everything with me. My notes from that night, snippets of overheard conversations, the email wording Alan had shared. Lydia leaned back in her chair as she listened. Then she sat forward, fingers pressed together. "This," she said, "goes beyond personal betrayal. We're entering legal territory now. Coercion, premeditation, concealment of original documents. It's time to take formal action." Daniel agreed. He looked across the table at me, not like a lawyer, but like someone who had known me through years of community dinners and planning meetings. "Are you ready for that?" he asked. I nodded. Completely. We began drafting the motion to contest the will, not just to reclaim my share, but to protect the integrity of what Patrick and I had built. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was real. And I wasn't going to let someone rewrite our story with red ink and cold hands. That afternoon, I walked home instead of driving. Each step reminded me of who I still was, his wife, his witness, his equal. The one who stayed when things got hard. The one who had walked beside him through grief, not just showed up for the photo ops. Rain came again that night. It whispered against the windows as I sat at the kitchen table. staring out at the maple trees Patrick had planted 30 years ago. He used to joke they'd outlive us both. Maybe they would. But what I knew for certain, what I felt down to the center of my bones, was that I couldn't let silence be the last thing he left behind. I didn't sleep much after we filed. I'd always believed in patience, in giving people space. But with every hour that passed, I realized that Rebecca wasn't just rewriting the future. She'd been editing the past for a long time. Then came Monday. Daniel called again. His voice was steady, but quicker than usual. "We found something else," he said. "Something that doesn't line up." I tightened my grip on the phone. "The version of the will that Rebecca filed. It's tied to a different case number, yes. But what matters is the absence of any documentation linking who initiated the change. That's unheard of." I already knew what he was going to say next. "We're bringing in a forensic specialist. Lydia has a contact. This person deals specifically with document fraud, contested signatures, and irregular timestamps. And we'll need access to Patrick's digital communications the last 6 months." I felt the heat rise in my face. "Do it," I said. "Take whatever you need." The next day, I brought in Patrick's medical files, old letters, anything that had his signature on it. Lydia would compare it to the revised will and trust. What we needed now wasn't suspicion. We needed doubt, solidified. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen and just sat. I didn't cry. I didn't pace or scream. I was done with all that. I just sat, letting the reality sink in. Not the betrayal. No, I had made peace with that part. What stung most was the thought that Patrick had tried. He had tried to protect me, but he hadn't known how deep it all went. He had trusted the wrong person. I thought back to one of our last real conversations, just a month before he passed. He had reached across the dinner table, squeezed my wrist, and whispered, "I've taken care of everything. Don't worry." And he meant it. He just didn't know someone else had already started unraveling it. 2 days later, Lydia called me into her office. Her assistant had spread estate documents across the table. Copies, charts, notes, and a printed email that made my hands go cold the moment I read the subject line. Revised structure, immediate actions. It was sent by Rebecca, 6 weeks before Patrick passed. Marked confidential. Inside the message was one simple line that cut deeper than anything I'd read so far. "Remove co-beneficiary privileges per our discussion." Just like that. No sentiment. No explanation. Just erasure. Lydia looked at me and asked softly, "Are you ready to proceed to hearing?" "Yes," I said with no hesitation. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and legal back and forth. I kept to myself. I walked each evening through the neighborhood, past the same porches and trees I'd passed for decades. People waved. Some asked how I was doing. I smiled, nodded. But I didn't explain. There was no need. Truth doesn't always need to shout. By Thursday, we had what we needed to begin issuing subpoenas. Lydia filed to gain full access to Patrick's emails and requested to depose one of Rebecca's legal assistants, someone whose name had shown up on the notarized forms. That same name had been logged as a witness on multiple documents on a Sunday evening when the office was supposedly closed. Patrick never worked Sundays. He hated working weekends. And he never signed anything without asking me to review it first. That date told me everything I needed to know. I gave Lydia the green light to bring in a handwriting analyst. If we were going to fight, we were going to do it with the truth in our hands. That night, I walked out onto the porch and sat under the stars. I pulled Patrick's blanket tight around me and let the wind pass over my skin. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Clarity. The weekend arrived with a stillness that felt unfamiliar. I woke early on Saturday and drove to the cemetery without telling anyone. I needed to see him. Not the version of Patrick in photos or printed speeches or legal documents, but the man I loved, the one who made eggs every Sunday, who read his favorite mystery novels in the bathtub and fell asleep with glasses on his chest. The air was cold and heavy, gray, Clouds hung low over the hills. His headstone was simple, just the way he would have wanted it. His full name, 2 dates, and 1 line beneath. He lived with grace. He left with love. I stood there quietly, hands buried in my coat pockets. I didn't say anything aloud. There was no need. If he was listening, he'd already heard everything I hadn't said. I didn't blame him anymore. Not for the silence, not for the trust he'd placed in someone who didn't deserve it. Grief does strange things to the heart. It twists you up, turns anger into guilt, and guilt into questions with no answers. But I wasn't standing there to ask why anymore. I was standing there to promise that the truth wouldn't be buried with him. When I got home, Lydia had left me a voicemail. Her voice was firm but calm. The assistant agreed to be deposed. She's coming in Tuesday morning. Ava Kendall, that was her name. She was in her mid-30s, quiet, sharp-eyed, a little nervous from what Lydia had said. But she'd seen something, and more importantly, she was ready to talk. Tuesday morning arrived in that muted way winter mornings do. Foggy sidewalks, breath visible in the air, the hum of city buses passing by like ghosts. When I arrived at Lydia's office, Ava was already inside the conference room. She wore a simple gray cardigan, dark jeans, no makeup. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, but her eyes were steady. Lydia greeted her with a warm smile and explained the process. Ava nodded. I'm not here to accuse anyone. I want the truth to be clear. She began with the timeline. Rebecca had brought her in on the estate revisions 6 weeks before Patrick died. Ava found the entire process unusually fast. Normally, she explained, someone of Mr. Sloane's profile would go through multiple meetings, approvals, formal signatures. But that didn't happen here. There was one night that stuck with her the most. She had returned to the office late. She'd left her jacket behind. It was a Sunday, around 7:45 p.m. When she walked in, she saw Rebecca and another staffer in the glass conference room. There were unsigned documents spread out across the table. I was halfway to the break room when Rebecca called me in. She said she needed a quick witness signature. Told me Patrick had just stepped out, that it was urgent. She seemed calm, casual even. I didn't think twice, but I didn't see him. I didn't see Patrick. She pulled out a small planner from her bag and opened it. Her voice trembled slightly. I wrote it down because something about it just didn't sit right. The note read, Sunday, 7:43 p.m., witnessed for R. No P present. She had been a silent observer, tucked behind systems and tasks, never sure what she was part of until the whole picture unfolded. Lydia asked gentle, clarifying questions. Ava answered them all. No hesitation. No embellishments. Just facts. Then she said something that made my entire body freeze. I overheard Rebecca on the phone once. It was 2 days before Mr. Sloane was hospitalized for the last time. She was in her office with the door cracked open. She was speaking fast. I remember the phrase exactly. Ava looked straight at me. Liquidate silently. No delays. No emotion. No compassion. Just cold words. Words said while my husband was still alive. I closed my eyes briefly, the sound of that phrase echoing inside my skull. Lydia reached across the table and handed Ava a pen. She signed her statement, dated it, then placed it face down on the folder. I kept my mouth shut for too long, she said quietly. I thought maybe I was just imagining things or overstepping. But now that I see what's happened, I can't stay quiet. We thanked her. Daniel walked her out. When the door closed, Lydia sat down across from me and placed her hands on the table, fingers interlocked. That was the break, she said softly. We have a direct timestamp, a first-hand witness, language that indicates intent. Daniel leaned back in his chair. For the first time, I saw something shift in his expression, relief. But I didn't feel it. Not yet. Because I knew what came next. Rebecca would find out. And when she did, she wouldn't panic. She would plan. Sure enough, 2 days later, a courier delivered a cream-colored envelope to my door. Inside was a letter from her attorney. Polished, controlled, threatening. They accused me of interfering with a lawful estate transition, claimed I was motivated by grief and bitterness, warned that if I didn't withdraw the legal motion within 10 business days, they would pursue damages. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it neatly and set it beside my morning tea like it was nothing more than a napkin. And I picked up the phone. "Daniel," I said, "I've been more than okay for years. I've just been quiet." He chuckled softly. "That's the best thing I've heard all week." That afternoon, Lydia filed our full rebuttal. Attached were Ava's notes, her signed deposition, metadata comparisons, signature inconsistencies, and calendar logs from the office security system, showing that Patrick had never entered the building the weekend those documents were supposedly signed. The file was thick. It carried weight, but more than that, it carried intention. We weren't chasing revenge. We were recovering truth. Truth that had been slowly buried under arrogance and ambition. That night, I sat on the back porch, blanket around my shoulders, listening to the trees rustle gently in the wind. For the first time since this began, I felt something shift, not a resolution, not yet, but a subtle realignment. Like the story that had gone off course was beginning to bend back toward center. Rebecca had edited Patrick's final chapter, but I still had the original draft, and I was finally ready to turn the page. The following morning, an envelope arrived, slipped under my front door with no stamp and no handwriting, just a typed label from the foundation. Inside was an official-looking invitation, printed on thick cream-colored paper. It was for a meeting at the new foundation office downtown. According to the contents, the board would be finalizing the transition of executive authority, presumably handing full control to Rebecca. There was no mention of the lawsuit, no acknowledgement of the legal motion already filed, just polite wording and polished phrases, like none of this was happening behind the scenes. It was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. I read it once, then again. And then I laid it beside my coffee like it was nothing important, but deep down I knew this was a message, more than that, a performance. Rebecca wanted me to see it. She wanted me to come and watch her take the seat she believed she'd earned. She wanted to sit in the very chair Patrick and I had once designed together and smile like she had built it all herself. I picked up the phone and called Lydia. "I want to go," I said simply. She didn't try to stop me. "Do you want someone to come with you?" "No," I said. "This isn't about confrontation. It's about something else." "What?" "Presence. I wanted Rebecca to see what she'd tried to erase. I wanted to walk into that room and stand in the very silence she thought would protect her." Thursday came cold and clear. I arrived 5 minutes early. The new foundation office was a glass box, floor-to-ceiling windows, marble tiles, quiet elevators. Modern. Sterile. Nothing like the warm old space we used to hold meetings in, where coffee cups sat on ring-marked tables and Patrick doodled in the margins of his notes when things dragged too long. The receptionist barely looked up when I gave my name, just nodded toward the hallway. The door at the end was already open. Inside the room, I recognized many of the faces, men and women who had once laughed with Patrick over potlucks, who'd handed me paper plates with catered chicken and called me dear. Now they nodded politely, distant, unsure. No one asked me where I'd been, but they noticed I was there. Rebecca sat at the head of the table. Her navy blue suit was tailored perfectly, hair pulled into a sleek knot, a pale blouse, a discreet watch. Nothing flashy, just calculated elegance. When she saw me, her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Then, as if a switch flipped, she regained her composure. She nodded. I nodded back. I took a seat at the far end of the table, away from the folders, the mints, the printed agenda. The meeting began with small updates, donor notes, upcoming initiatives, budget discussions. Standard foundation language with no emotion, like any other corporate boardroom. Then the chairperson said it was time to move to the next item, the transition of executive oversight. Rebecca cleared her throat. She thanked everyone for their continued support, spoke about Patrick's legacy, about honoring his vision, about moving forward with dignity and structure. Every sentence was perfectly placed, rehearsed, and confident. Then she said something that made the entire room freeze, if only for a breath. I want to thank Marietta for the years she stood beside Patrick, especially in the early days when this foundation was just a vision. Her grace helped shape everything we are. She paused, then added, and now, with her grace, I carry it forward. Her grace, like I had bowed, like I had handed it over. I felt my breath catch, not from anger, but from clarity. She believed this was hers now, that I had stepped aside, that I would stay silent forever. But she was wrong. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small envelope. Quietly, without drama, I passed it to the man sitting next to me. Patrick's oldest friend on the board, a kind man named Frank who had known us since we were newlyweds. He looked confused but opened it. Inside were 3 things: a copy of Ava Kendall's signed statement, a summary page from Lydia's legal brief, and a copy of the altered trust page with red ink and margin notes Rebecca had written, evidence of erasure. He read silently, then passed it to the person beside him, and so it went down the long table, hand to hand. Rebecca saw it. Her smile tightened. Her fingers froze mid-sentence. She tried to keep speaking, but no one was listening anymore. When the packet reached the end of the table, I stood. "Thank you for the invitation," I said gently, clearly. "My attorney will be in touch if anyone requires clarification." And then I walked out, not rushed, not flustered, just steady. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to argue. I had brought the truth into the room. I had been present, and in doing so, I had rewritten the power dynamic she thought she'd locked down. That evening, Lydia called. "One of the board members already reached out," she said. "They're pausing the transition vote. They want a full internal review." Daniel called too. His voice was lighter than it had been in weeks. "What you did today," he said, "wasn't confrontation. It was redirection." And it was. Rebecca had expected me to fade. She had written her script to end with my silence, but I had shown up, handed them a new ending, and left without a single raised voice. Over the next several days, the ripple effects began. The board postponed their vote. Rebecca's lawyer went quiet. A request was submitted for an independent third party to review the amended trust documents. There was no guarantee what would come next. No promises of court victories or public apologies, but something important had changed. Doubt. That stain didn't vanish, and in that hesitation, I found something I hadn't touched in months: balance. That Saturday, I took Patrick's old file box from the study, one filled with notes on mentorship programs, grant drafts, and his original foundation charter. I sorted through it, slowly, reverently. Each page reminded me of what we had actually built, before Rebecca's edits, before the spin. Then I packed it all carefully and called Daniel. "I want these archived," I told him. "Not as evidence, as history." The truth didn't need to shout. It just needed to be preserved. The week that followed was quieter than I expected. No legal threats, no surprise calls, no more glossy invitations tucked under my door. It was as if a curtain had finally fallen on the stage Rebecca had crafted, and the audience had quietly stood up and walked away. But I didn't mistake that silence for surrender. Lydia warned me early on, when people go quiet, it usually means they're calculating. But this time, I wasn't the one who needed to be ready. I had already spoken. I had already acted. Now it was her turn to face the echo. The days passed slowly, gently. I found myself slipping back into my rhythm, watering the plants before sunrise, folding laundry while the kettle boiled, reading the paper at the kitchen table with Patrick's blanket draped across my legs. I no longer felt the need to rush. I no longer reached for my planner the second I woke up. And then on a Sunday afternoon, Lydia called. Her voice was calm, but beneath it, I could hear something different, a note of finality. "She's stepping down," she said. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. Rebecca has formally withdrawn from her role as managing executive of the foundation. No admission of wrongdoing. No apology. Just a clean statement. She says it's to protect the foundation's image and honor Patrick's legacy. I leaned back in my chair. Let the words settle. I didn't feel the wave of triumph I thought I would. I didn't throw my arms in the air or shout in relief. I simply nodded to myself and whispered, "Good." The next day, the foundation issued a formal press release. Rebecca's name was gone. In her place was a temporary oversight committee, made up of senior board members, all of whom had worked with Patrick during the early years. The release was short, polite, free of drama, but to me it was loud. It was acknowledgement without needing to say a word. Daniel forwarded me a copy of the release, along with a short note from one of the committee members. "You were right to protect what mattered." Those words, simple, weightless on the page, made my eyes burn. They didn't undo what had happened. They didn't erase the betrayal or replace what had been taken. But they saw me, and sometimes that's enough. Later that week, Lydia and I met in person one final time. She had compiled a clean summary of the case, where it stood what we could pursue next: damages, restitution, even a formal claim of misconduct. She laid out the options, clearly no pressure. I read through everything in silence, then closed the folder. "No," I said gently. "I don't want to take it any further." Lydia looked up. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I nodded. This was never about revenge. It was about truth, and I already won that part. She smiled, softly, respectfully, and gathered the papers without argument. After she left, I opened the drawer of Patrick's desk, the one I had avoided for months. Inside were little pieces of him: grocery lists, sticky notes with half-written thoughts, a receipt from a roadside cafe we stopped at 15 years ago. Beneath an old ledger, I found an envelope I didn't recognize. No label, no seal, just thick paper, slightly yellowed. Inside was a copy of a much older will. It was dated a year before the changes Rebecca made. His handwriting filled the margins, familiar loops and pauses. He had written notes next to every paragraph, circling specific words, adding little reminders like "discuss with Marietta" or "confirm housing clause." One section near the end had been underlined twice. "My wife, Marietta Sloan, shall remain my lifelong co-trustee and advisor in all foundation matters. Her voice is to be heard equal to mine." I stared at the line, read it again, and again. At the bottom of the document, beneath the signature, was one final sentence, scrawled in Patrick's tired hand. "Legacy is not about names or wealth. It's about showing up when no one else is watching." He hadn't given up on me. Not really. He had tried in his way to make sure I would still be seen. I sat there in the soft silence of our study until the daylight faded and the shadows climbed the walls. Then I placed the document back in the folder and carried it to Daniel the next morning. "Not for court," I told him. "Not for filing. Just for history." He understood. A few weeks later, the foundation invited me to stop by the new office. Not for any official role, not as a public statement, just to reconnect. The atmosphere was different this time. Lighter. Real. The committee greeted me not as a figurehead or a name on a document, but as someone who had helped build what they were trying to hold on to. They asked me to review an old scholarship file, one of Patrick's early programs for underprivileged students. I nodded, took the folder, and offered quiet suggestions. No titles, no applause, just presence. That evening, I walked slowly through the parking lot. The sun was low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the concrete. I paused by my car, turned to look back at the building. It shimmered in the light, no longer intimidating, no longer a fortress built to shut me out. Just glass and steel. It didn't own me anymore. It was just a place, and I had already reclaimed what mattered. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen and sat by the window with a cup of tea. I thought of Ava with her quiet courage. I thought of Lydia and Daniel, who didn't just fight for the law, they fought for the story behind it. And I thought of myself, not the woman who had been erased in a boardroom or ignored at a funeral, but the one who had returned, fully, quietly, on her own terms, to write the ending of the story with her own hand. It had been just over a month since Rebecca formally stepped down, and in that time the world around me shifted in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. There were no dramatic endings, no final courtroom showdowns. Instead, there was peace, not the kind you force or chase, but the kind that grows when you've faced something heavy and made it through standing. The foundation moved forward without her. The temporary committee, though still finding their footing, worked with transparency and care. I stayed at a respectful distance, stepping in only when asked, offering notes on scholarships, reviewing legacy documentation, or clarifying details in early drafts of the Foundation's updated mission. One afternoon, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. It was from a young woman named Elena, someone who had received one of our earliest grants through the Foundation years ago. She'd heard through a colleague that I was involved again in a quiet capacity and wanted to thank me. Her note was short, clumsy in spots, but full of heart. She told me that the scholarship she'd received helped her attend college, that now she was working at a local nonprofit, mentoring girls from the same neighborhood she grew up in. She didn't know the full story behind what had happened with the Foundation. She didn't need to. Her life had changed because of something Patrick and I started, and now she was continuing that work in her own small, powerful way. I held her letter in my hands, longer than I meant to, running my fingers over her uneven signature at the bottom. That's what legacy looked like, not the signature on a legal form, not a title at the top of a Foundation's page. Legacy was when your intentions reached someone you'd never met and helped them believe they could stand taller. That evening, I looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen that had once felt cold and unfamiliar after the funeral. But now, it was full again, not with people or sound, but with presence. My presence. The presence of memory, of clarity, of everything I had fought to preserve. I didn't feel erased anymore. I felt restored. I didn't light candles out of grief anymore. I lit them in quiet celebration. Small flames to mark each step forward, each breath reclaimed. Spring came slowly that year. The daffodils in the community garden, the same garden Patrick and I had helped fund behind the local center, pushed through the earth with soft yellow heads. The early tulips followed, pink and pale orange, lining the sidewalk outside the Foundation's new office. I didn't visit often, but when I did, I walked slowly. I didn't carry files. I didn't bring an agenda. I simply showed up to listen, to see, to remember. One morning, another envelope arrived. This one bore raised lettering and smelled faintly of fresh ink. It was an invitation to the annual donor luncheon, an event Patrick and I had helped create 2 decades ago but hadn't attended in recent years. I opened it slowly, scanning the list of honored guests. My name was there again, printed, acknowledged. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go, not because I was nervous, but because I didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore. Still, something tugged at me. A quiet voice, maybe Patrick's, reminding me that sometimes presence matters more than words. So I went. I wore a soft gray suit, one Patrick had always liked, and pinned his old lapel pin to my collar. A small silver oak tree. Steady, rooted, unshakable. The ballroom hadn't changed much. The same round tables, polished floors, soft background music. People milled around with drinks and small plates, laughing, sharing polite stories. Rebecca wasn't there. Her name had been removed from the programs, replaced by the committee's shared signature and a new mission statement, one that echoed the values Patrick and I had always believed in, but this time in words I recognized. I didn't speak much. I didn't need to. Near the end of the event, a younger board member, a woman named Lee, stepped onto the stage. She couldn't have been more than 30, but her voice was clear and composed. She thanked the donors, the volunteers, the people who had carried the foundation through a difficult transition. Then, after a brief pause, she said my name. Not loudly, not ceremoniously, just warmly. She spoke briefly about the early days, about Patrick's original dream and the woman who had stood beside him not with loud declarations, but with quiet strength. I didn't expect it, but when the room turned toward me in gentle applause, I stood, just for a moment, just enough to nod, not for attention, not for recognition, but as a simple acknowledgement that I had made it through, and that I was still here. The applause didn't linger. It wasn't a standing ovation or a spotlight moment. It was just long enough to feel real, just long enough for me to feel seen. I stepped out of the ballroom soon after, leaving through the side hallway instead of the main entrance. I wasn't escaping. I just didn't want the conversation that often followed such moments. The polite compliments, the empty nods, the surface-level praise from people who hadn't been there during the quiet, brutal hours when truth had to be fought for in the dark. Outside, the air was soft with late spring, warm enough to walk without a coat, but still cool in the shadows. I walked slowly to the parking lot, heels clicking on the pavement, each step deliberate, unhurried. The sun was starting to set behind the nearby buildings, casting a golden wash across the sky, soft, glowing, like a whispered memory rather than a declaration. I sat in the car a long time before starting the engine, not because I was tired, but because I was full in a way I hadn't been in months. The silence around me wasn't heavy anymore. It was light, expansive. It held no shame, no confusion, just clarity. Back home, I kicked off my shoes at the door, made myself a simple dinner, and sat by the window with a glass of tea, watching the light fade. The candle on the table flickered beside me. I didn't light it for grief anymore. I lit it now to remember something simpler. Presence, intention, grounding. The next morning, Daniel called, not for anything urgent, just to check in. I read the committee's letter, he said. They've asked if you'd consider returning as an honorary advisor. Nothing formal. No obligations. Just your voice. I was quiet for a moment. They're doing fine, I said. They've found their way. They have, he agreed. But maybe they also know the path was built by someone who didn't need to shout to leave a mark. I smiled that. Let me think about it. And I did. For a few days, I walked with the idea like a stone in my pocket, feeling its weight, turning it over with quiet fingers. I wasn't interested in titles anymore. I didn't want control. What I wanted was something simpler, to protect the soul of what Patrick and I had started. And maybe that meant being present, not as a leader or trustee, but as memory, as witness, as truth. So I said yes. One afternoon, I went in quietly and met with the committee. They showed me the updated charter, the revised mission statement, the fresh programs they were designing for single mothers, refugee families, and youth mentorship. It wasn't perfect, nothing meaningful ever is, but it was sincere, thoughtful. I listened more than I spoke. That was always my way. But I saw it in their eyes when they looked at me, not pity, not politeness. Respect. Before I left, one of the younger members, an intern, barely out of college, walked me to the elevator. She seemed hesitant at first, then finally said, I've read everything you and Patrick built. I just wanted to say, we're trying to do it justice. I smiled. You're already doing better than you think. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, watching her nod softly as they closed. Back home, I opened the box I hadn't touched in weeks, the one where I'd placed the old photographs, letters, and original drafts of Patrick's work. I wasn't opening it to cry or ache this time. I was opening it to preserve it properly. I organized each page by year, tucked photos into sleeves, labeled the programs we had started, marked which ones were still active, and gently closed the file with a small note inside. For the next set of hands, be gentle, be brave. Then I wrapped the box in a soft linen cloth, placed it on the study shelf where the sun would hit it every morning, and left it there. Not hidden, not buried, just waiting, like memory often does, for the right moment to be touched again. In the evenings, I began writing again. Not a book, not a speech, just little things, letters to Patrick, journal entries, reflections on what it meant to be part of something bigger than yourself, and what it felt like to be almost erased and yet still return, louder in silence than ever before. One of the letters I wrote to Patrick read like this: "You'd laugh if you saw me now, sitting at your desk, drinking lukewarm tea, trying to make sense of a world that keeps moving even after everything breaks. But I'm okay, Patrick. I really am. Not because it's all been fixed, but because I learned that healing doesn't mean erasing the pain. It just means carrying it better. I carry you better now. I carry us both." There was no reply, of course, but the room felt warmer after that. The next week, I visited the garden outside the community center where the tulips were now fully bloomed. A child no older than 7 was helping his grandmother water the plants. He asked questions about each flower, naming them wrong, laughing when she corrected him. She wore a pale pink scarf and a denim jacket, face soft with lines from years of joy and trouble. She looked at me once and nodded, just a quiet nod, one that said, "I see you," and I nodded back, because sometimes that's all you need, just to be seen. Months passed. Life didn't return to what it once was, but it found a rhythm again, a new one, quieter, slower, more intentional, the kind of rhythm that comes after a storm, when the wind settles and you're left not with wreckage, but with space. Space to rebuild, space to breathe. The foundation didn't just survive, it matured. The board adopted stronger policies, implemented better transparency, and began honoring the kind of legacy that wasn't measured in donations or events, but in the quiet ways people were uplifted. I stayed involved, but only at a distance. I gave them my blessing, my notes when asked, and my stories when they needed reminders of how it all began. One crisp afternoon, I returned to the original office building, the one Patrick and I had painted ourselves the first week we opened the foundation. The new tenants had turned it into a community reading space, filled with old books, worn couches, and the faint smell of coffee and history. They didn't know who I was. I didn't need them to. I sat in the back corner and watched as a little girl with curly hair tugged her mother toward the shelf labeled Adventure. She couldn't have been more than 6, but she held the book like it was treasure. That was enough. That was everything. Legacy, I had learned, wasn't about keeping control. It wasn't about names on plaques or titles and bylaws. It was about what survived when the noise faded. It was about presence, quiet presence, the kind that echoes even after you're gone. One evening, I lit a final candle. No grief in its glow, just gratitude. I looked around the home Patrick and I had filled, not just with things, but with effort, with story, with purpose. The walls didn't ache anymore. They breathed. The silence didn't scream. It whispered peace. And I whispered back. I kept my promise. The lesson? Never underestimate the power of quiet strength. The world often gives its loudest rooms to the boldest voices, but real truth, real legacy, is built in silence, protected by those willing to stand in it without applause. You don't always have to fight with noise. Sometimes all it takes is showing up again and again until your presence becomes undeniable. And if someone tries to erase you, write yourself back in, line by line, gently but unshakably, because the truth, when held with love, is louder than anything ambition can ever forge.